Attraction isn't learned. It's remembered. It doesn't arrive through charm or crafted phrases. It rises slowly, like a man returning to himself after years of noise. There's a silent emotional reality most never talk about. The strongest men aren't performing. They're just no longer apologizing for who they've become. The world calls it mystery, charisma, magnetism, but it's none of that. It's the echo of self-respect after silence has burned through all the masks. Most men don't realize they're not trying to be attractive. They're trying not to be invisible. There's a wound no one names, the need to be liked. And beneath that, something worse, the need to be chosen. You try to fit. You try to please. You try to say the right thing, hold the right posture, mimic what they want. But when all of it fades, when the applause stops, you'll be forced to ask, was any of that me? Being liked is not the same as being chosen. And being chosen means nothing if she never respected the man she picked. Zeno of Citium didn't start Stoicism with pride. He started it in ruin. He lost everything, his ship, his wealth, his direction. Most would call it failure, but he understood something deeper. What breaks is often just what didn't belong. The shipwreck wasn't loss, it was clarity. That kind of clarity is where real presence is born, not from having, but from shedding, not from knowing, but from becoming still enough to remember. Attraction, in its rawest form, is the gravity of a man who stopped performing and started standing. Seneca once wrote, "To be everywhere is to be nowhere." That's how most men live, fragmented, reaching, scattering their presence across smiles, texts, jokes, gestures, trying to matter, trying to be enough. But a man who needs to be seen disappears. A man who's willing to be misunderstood without flinching. That's someone people orbit without knowing why. Your presence isn't how loud you are, it's how little of yourself you're willing to lose for approval. This isn't a video about tactics. It's not about lines, signals, or steps to get her. This is about remembering what was always yours before the world told you to earn it. It's about peeling off what never fit you. It's about building a center so unshakable, even silence respects you. When you stop chasing validation, when you stop auditioning for connection, what's left is magnetic, and what's real doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to be explained. It just stands. It just stays. And if you stay long enough in your own presence, something returns. Not a technique, not a performance, just gravity. And she'll feel it, not because you made her, but because you finally stopped trying. There's a cost to constantly wondering how you're being perceived. You don't notice it at first. It starts small, a slight shift in how you speak, a pause before you answer, the need to make her laugh even when you're tired. And over time, without realizing it, you begin to perform. You tell stories that impress. You avoid silence like it's shame. You enter every moment like a stage, not a home. And what began as connection turns into a role. You stop being you and become whoever she responds to. There's a man I once knew who had a story for every room. He made people smile. He made women lean in. But when his father died, no one called. Not because they didn't care, but because they never saw his soul. They only saw his surface. His stories were a wall, and behind that wall, he was alone. That's what performance does. It earns admiration and sacrifices intimacy. The man who needs everyone to like him never gets seen by anyone. Your nervous system is wired for resonance. Mirror neurons reflect emotional congruence. But when you chase approval, you sever that alignment. You smile while hiding grief. You nod while disagreeing. You laugh too loud, speak too fast, reveal too much, and then wonder why nothing feels solid. Women don't trust charm. They feel through it. They crave stillness, not applause. You can't fake gravity. You either carry weight or you don't. So ask yourself this, quietly. What's left of you when no one claps? Who are you when the room goes cold and there's no echo to affirm your presence? If you don't have an answer, that's where the work begins. Attraction isn't what you create. It's what remains when all creation stops. It's the presence you carry when you're no longer trying to be seen, just refusing to be erased. And that weight, the one you feel when you stop chasing, is the beginning of your magnetism. Most men are terrified of being misunderstood. They explain themselves, justify every silence, overcorrect at the slightest misinterpretation. But the deeper truth is this: the need to be understood is often the need to be approved. It's a subtle plea for acceptance, disguised as clarity. And the moment you make that your mission, getting her to understand you, you've already surrendered your center. A man who truly knows his path doesn't need others to see it. He just walks it. Zeno never begged for agreement. He didn't preach to be followed. He lived his code with such quiet consistency that even his enemies couldn't deny his depth. Masculine gravity is built like that, not by being relatable, but by being rooted. And rooted men don't panic when they're misunderstood. They don't flinch when their silence is misread. They don't argue their worth. They simply remain still enough for their presence to speak louder than their explanations. This is polarity in its rawest form. The man holds his axis. The world turns around him. And even when she doesn't get your silence, even when your calm is mistaken for distance, she will feel something she can't name. That's not failure. That's power. You're not here to be translated. You're here to be felt. And that feeling, steady, unforced, immovable, is what draws her in without a word. A man's signal isn't in what he says. It's in what he endures without reacting. What you tolerate silently becomes your language. And if your signal is fractured by the need to be decoded, you'll always attract confusion. But if you can remain misunderstood and still walk with clarity, you become rare. You become a man who is not just seen, but sensed. And that kind of presence doesn't chase attention. It creates it. You don't lose her all at once. It happens slowly, beneath the surface, in moments so quiet they almost feel harmless. You agree when you don't want to. You laugh at things that don't move you. You adopt her opinions to keep the peace, to seem aligned, to avoid conflict. And with every small shift, you trade a piece of yourself for temporary connection. But connection built on self-abandonment never lasts, because eventually, she stops feeling you. And when a woman can no longer feel your center, she starts drifting from it. I knew a man who became everything she asked for. He changed his clothes, his friends, even his values. At first, it seemed like love, but over time she looked at him with confusion, not anger, not disappointment, just absence. He had shapeshifted so many times, she could no longer see the man who once stood in front of her. And when he asked why she was distant, she couldn't answer, because the truth was too quiet to name. He had erased himself. A man without a center cannot hold presence. He becomes reactive, easily swayed, full of gestures, but void of gravity. And when you lose your spine in the name of closeness, she stops trusting you. Not because you're unkind, but because you're unstable. Attraction doesn't grow in agreement. It grows in integrity. It grows when your yes means something, when your no isn't afraid to be spoken, when you can hold your ground without holding resentment. Stoicism is not detachment, it's rootedness. It's saying, this is who I am, even if it costs me your comfort, even if it costs me you. That kind of steadiness isn't loud, but it's unforgettable, because in a world of men who bend for approval, the one who stands becomes a reference point, not just for her, but for himself. There's a sacred strength in a man who can be open. But openness is not the same as spilling. Somewhere along the line, vulnerability was confused with exposure. Men were told to share, to be transparent, to let it all out. But what they weren't told was that when you open everything without purpose, you don't invite intimacy. You provoke uncertainty. You teach her to doubt your frame. You hand her your emotions like a weight you don't want to carry, and hope she holds it better than you could. A man once sat across from me and said, she wanted me to talk more. So I did. But what he gave her wasn't depth. It was unfiltered grief, unanchored pain, emotion without ground. And instead of bringing them closer, it made her withdraw, not because she didn't care, but because she couldn't trust his structure. Vulnerability isn't about volume, it's about direction. It's not how much you feel, it's how cleanly you hold what you feel without needing to collapse inside it. Emotional leakage is when your wounds spill into every space. It's when your feelings control the moment, instead of being honored within it. Stoic masculinity isn't about silence, it's about sovereignty. You can feel fully, you can even cry, but it must be yours, not hers to fix, not hers to manage, not hers to absorb. When you flood her with your storm, she stops seeing you as a shelter. And what she needed wasn't your breakdown, it was your foundation. Epictetus once said, practice not what you preach, but what you tolerate. In other words, hold what you feel with dignity. Speak when it brings clarity. Share when it deepens trust, but never bleed just to prove you're alive. That doesn't connect. That confuses. And when you confuse her, you lose her, not because you're too emotional, but because you lost the form that made your emotion meaningful. She doesn't need you to be perfect. She needs you to be steady, and steadiness begins in restraint. Not repression, but reverence. You've been lied to about what makes a man attractive. You were told it was looks, status, muscles, money. And while those things may turn heads, they don't hold gaze. Real attraction, lasting, gravitational, undeniable, isn't about symmetry. It's about presence. The kind that can't be faked. The kind that walks into a room and doesn't ask for attention, but alters the temperature of the room without speaking. There's science behind it. Focused masculine energy changes the way a woman's brain responds. Her oxytocin rises not because of what she sees, but because of how deeply she feels seen. And that doesn't happen when you're distracted, performative, or seeking approval. It happens when your attention lands fully, quietly, without hunger, when your gaze doesn't wander, when your energy doesn't scatter, when you're so present she can feel your stillness more than your smile. There's a man I once watched walk into a crowded place. He said nothing, didn't smile, didn't scan the room. He just stood, calm, self-possessed, as if he had nothing to prove because he already knew where he stood. And within minutes, the attention shifted. Not because he demanded it, but because he carried a presence that didn't chase. That's what women respond to. Not your words, not your features, but your capacity to remain undisturbed. Zeno's stillness wasn't passive. It was anchored in awareness. He embodied the kind of charisma that needs no spotlight. Because when a man becomes centered enough, still enough, and quiet enough, he becomes a mirror. And in that mirror, people feel themselves more clearly. That's what draws her in. Not your pursuit of her eyes, but the gravity she senses in a man who no longer needs to be seen to know he's real. At some point, every man has to choose: perform to be liked, or live to be remembered. Impressing is exhausting. You monitor every reaction, calibrate every word, shapeshift in the hope that something sticks. But it never lasts, because performance demands an audience. And when the audience changes, so do you. That's not presence, that's survival. And no woman truly wants to orbit a man who survives by disappearing into others. But something changes when you stop trying to impress and start building your code, when your life becomes less about perception and more about alignment. You begin to move differently, speak slower, listen with depth, enter rooms not with noise, but with orientation. People can feel the difference because it's rare. A man who doesn't chase attention but radiates direction. A man who walks out of a space before he's needed and still becomes the one they remember. When you start living by a code, your entire body changes. Your posture aligns, your rhythm slows, your speech sharpens. You don't need to explain yourself. You don't need to please. You just remain congruent. And that congruence is what attraction feeds on. Because she doesn't want entertainment. She wants certainty. She wants to feel something ancient in you, something that doesn't shift just because she walks into the room. Attraction isn't what you do. It's the echo of who you refuse to stop being. And that echo builds volume when your life stops being a performance and starts becoming a practice. Not of control, but of clarity, of quiet values, of deep structure. And once you become that man, not overnight, but over time, impression fades. Gravity remains. And in that gravity, she doesn't just notice you. She feels safe near you. Not because you tried to impress her, but because you stopped needing to. Most men stay too long, not out of weakness, but out of hope. Hope that she'll change. Hope that things will return to how they were. Hope that love by itself is enough to restore respect. But here's the truth. When respect dies, presence fades. And once your presence fades, no amount of words will bring it back. You can't negotiate your way back into value. You can only walk away with what's left of your dignity intact. There's a kind of strength that doesn't show itself in confrontation, but in departure. The men who attract the deepest attention aren't the ones who convince. They're the ones who recognize the absence of respect early and leave without spectacle. They don't raise their voice. They don't prove their worth. They exit quietly because they know what they carry and refuse to beg for someone to remember. They'd rather be forgotten in truth than held in falsehood. Psychologically, withdrawal triggers pursuit more than persuasion ever could. But that's not the point. You don't walk away to make her chase. You walk away because your soul no longer recognizes itself in the reflection of that relationship. And staying becomes self-erasure. So you choose the harder path, the colder one, the silent one, not out of bitterness, but out of reverence for who you've become. Marcus Aurelius said, The best revenge is not to be like your enemy. That's not just about morality. It's about mastery. She may remember you not for what you said, but for how you left. With no drama, no demands, just a closed door and a full spine. Because the most attractive men aren't the ones who stayed hoping. They're the ones who walked, quietly, firmly, fully, when they realized their worth no longer had a home there. Attraction isn't a game. It's not a series of moves. It's not strategy. It's structure. A man doesn't become magnetic by learning what to say. He becomes magnetic by remembering who he is when he stops needing to be approved, applauded, or chosen. And that remembrance only begins in silence, when the noise fades, when the pretending ends, when the applause no longer matters. Zeno of Citium lost everything. And in that collapse, he found philosophy. He found the core. The shipwreck wasn't a tragedy. It was the beginning of truth. Your breakdown, the moment she left, the silence that followed, the ache you tried to hide, none of it was wasted. That pain carved out space. That loss stripped illusion. And from that hollow place, you can now build presence, not from tactics, but from stillness. Chrysippus, another voice in the lineage of Stoicism, once taught that transformation doesn't mean becoming someone new. It means repeating the truth with deeper awareness. You don't need more confidence. You don't need louder words. You don't need to become a version of what others admire. You just need to return to your own spine. And keep returning, until your walk becomes prayer, until your silence becomes signal. She won't go crazy because you chased her. She'll go quiet because something in her senses that you stopped needing to be chosen. You started choosing yourself. And when a man finally chooses himself, not in ego, but in alignment, everything around him begins to recalibrate. He doesn't demand respect. He simply no longer stands where it's absent. He doesn't ask to be loved. He becomes love anchored in clarity. So become attractive, not for her, not for them, but for the man inside you, the one who waited too long to be seen. That man is still here, and now finally, you see him. That's who's watching now, and that, more than anything else, is what makes you impossible to forget.